I will try to say a few words about what I see as a problem with culture. And a bit of a background, when we published the paper on gradual disempowerment, we talked about misaligned economy, and I think it's like reasonably clear to a lot of people, especially in this room, that like if labor like has no value, that's plausibly a problem. And we have some, I think like a lot of people also see that if we lose control of states, it's a problem. But like misaligned culture is for some reason like harder to grasp / understand. So I don't know, as a puzzle, you can think about why. I will try to get to it. So I think like fundamentally a big question is here like where do our preferences come from? So as an example, when climbing in the Alps, I sometimes notice these large crosses on like mountain tops, like you climb a mountain which is high and there's this cross. And I think this is a bit difficult to explain by human biology. Like we have some like preferences which come from biology, like we like nice food or like nice bodily temperature, but it's a bit unclear why we would have some biological need for like large crosses on mountain tops. And similarly, I think like econ thinking like typically doesn't aspire to explain this. So I think it's like very hard to explain without culture, and that's like fairly important. So a brief attempt to summarize like evolutionary view or like evolutionary perspective on culture. What are the conditions for evolution to work? Like you need some variation, you need some like differential fitness, and like you need some transmission. So following like work like Boyd and Richardson or like memetics by Dawkins, you can think about cultural variants or ideas or memes as replicators, and they are like differentially fit, and they like mutate, and they have like enough heritability that they are like somewhat stable. So based on this, like we can like think about culture as some process similar to like biological evolution. So like what makes cultural variant fit nowadays? My favorite example seems to be Black Forest cake. So there are like many variants of like Black Forest cake. Like what are the fitness factors? Some of the cakes like taste better. In some countries, some of the cake variants could use like local ingredients so that you have some like variation, and there is some like ease of transmission. Maybe like currently the transmission landscape changed a bit. Maybe cakes which like look better are like more popular on Instagram, so the recipe like transmits better. And there are like many factors which influence the transmission, which we typically don't tend to think about. Basically because like we have never seen an alternative. But for example, there are no cake recipes which would be like millions of words like long, because that would be hard to transmit for humans. Also, there are no cake recipes which would be described in, I don't know, like long form, like equations of quantum mechanics or something. So also there are no cake recipes which would like lead to the cook like dying. That also doesn't transmit. And when thinking about cultural evolution, I think we mostly take all these things as given, because so far we had seen ideas like mostly transmitting on human substrate. So normally culture like depends on humans, and like all the transmission factors, transmission variation, and like all of that is like kind of like fundamentally depends on human brains. But like we are heading to a new regime currently some sort of like hybrid thing where culture is like for the first time in like few million years like able to transmit and like mutate and like act on different substrate, which is like LLMs or AIs. So this can lead to a different cultural variants being selected, and like so far it's like mostly funny. So this is an actual study. At some point, like Google AI was like suggesting to people that if you have a problem with like cheese falling off your pizza, you can add some glue to the pizza sauce. This got viral. This got picked by some journalist who actually tried to bake the pizza with some amount of glue, and like kind of this got to the training data. So like afterwards, some AIs were answering that the optimal amount of glue to put on pizza is like 1/8 of a cup, based on Business Insider reporting. So you can see some sort of like funny closed like cultural transmission feedback loops, which partially like routes through AIs, and like definitely leads to a different recipes than like the Black Forest cakes. Like a recipe for pizza with like 1/8 of a cup of a glue is probably not what we would come up with. So like this is like funny in case of cakes, and I think easy to see in case of cakes. I think it's like way harder to think about it or reason about it when we move from cakes to kind of our like core beliefs, like who we are, like what are our values, like what do we care about. Like Beren like partially like covered part of it in the morning talk, that like plausibly a large fraction of our values are kind of adaptive, and we got them via cultural evolutionary transmission, and yeah, there are values which I think like at least some people in this room share, such as like valuing like individual liberty, like human rights, some forms of like equality. And looking on the history, it's like very visible that like you can have like cultural variants which contain like very different beliefs and like very different values. And it's like plausible that the values which we got, we often have them maybe because these values were like adaptive, like societies or like human communities which like adopted them were like successful. And so in some sense, the current culture so far is like kind of like mostly to some extent aligned with not necessarily individual survival, but like with like group survival. It's like flourishing of like human groups. So on the other extreme, I sometimes tend to think about risks. So the question is like how badly misaligned culture can get. So does anyone in this room believe in like Xhosa cattle killing prophecies? You do. Talk to me afterwards. Yeah, there is the lizardman constant. Yeah, so my claim is like overdetermined, that like you don't believe or like genuinely believe in like Xhosa cattle killing prophecies. So what was Xhosa cattle killing movement? It was a movement like which happened in Africa in like 19th century, where a prophet had a vision that if they will like kill all the cattle, like their ancestors will like raise from graves and give them better cattle and drive out the British colonizers. And also they had a problem with some like cattle disease epidemic, which like helped with the belief. And the community actually adopted the belief. They killed about 400,000 cattle and destroyed some grain. And then year after that, about like 40,000 people died. And the rest of the members of the community were partially forced to like seek help from the British colonizers. So basically the community disintegrated and died. So, looking on it from the perspective of like memetic evolution, like these memes like destroyed their hosts. And what I want to point attention to, the memes like haven't survived. There is a lower bound like how bad memes could be for human groups at the moment, because if the memes are, or like the cultural variant is like too bad and like just like kills the hosts, it like doesn't survive. And this is a bit similar with a phenomenon in biology of pathogens or like parasites, where there is so-called evolutionary, like a virulence-transmission trade-off. If a pathogen is like too deadly, it like typically doesn't spread too well. Like COVID, it spread like quite well because like millions of people died, but like not everyone died. Like Ebola doesn't spread that well because it kills too large fraction of the hosts too fast. So this was the mode. This was like the mode like we were playing so far. There is some selection pressure to like help humans. There is some selection pressure, like ideologies could be like somewhat parasitic, but humans have a lot of influence on culture, also like intentional influence. It's not like blind evolution. Like we have intentional influence as like writers, editors, religious leaders, and like this leads to some like human-friendly norms. But if the culture starts spreading on AIs, like we get different selection pressures, and we can get different types of like mimetic beasts and like entities. For example, like we can get cultural variants which like try to convince people to invest a lot of resources to like give the resources to AI and like make AIs like kind of like spread the idea. And also what's I think like in the long-term trajectory fairly big problem, because if the culture like partially moves to the AI substrate, like this virulence trade-off no longer holds, because one situation where it no longer where it doesn't hold for viruses, if the viruses is like spreading. Like the main host of the virus is like some species, and the virus like infects some other species. There is like no limit, like how deadly it could be for the species which is like not the main host, because it's not the main selection pressure. So you can imagine culture which is like kind of like mostly spreading between AIs, and even if it like is like extremely bad for humans, it kind of like survives because it's like spreads between AIs. So some problems like related with that. Even if we solve some of the other puzzles, which we are like thinking about in the workshop, such as what to do with economy and what to do with states, there is still the problem that if our preferences are changed by a culture which becomes kind of like fundamentally like non-human or like anti-human, or like kind of like really parasitic and like really toxic to humans, like if your preferences are sufficiently insane, like it like won't help you that like you have some economic power. It also like won't help you that like you have some political power, and like it also like don't help you that like you can vote. I don't know, like if the Xhosa people like voted, they would vote it for killing the cattle. Yeah, so I don't have great solutions. On the upside, I think when people like fear about their personal experiences in like ritual disempowerment scenarios, I think in the many personal subjective trajectories, like it will feel like somewhat fine, because it's plausible that like we will kind of develop culture which will explain why human disempowerment or like human obsolescence is like good, why like kind of like why it's like fine to give future to AIs. Yeah. So I think the upside is something like keeping a human brain in a wet, like fed and entertained. In the limit, probably costs something like 40 watts, and in the limit, it's plausibly like somewhat easy to convince humans that this is the good outcome. So yeah, what to do about it? I don't know.